When I sew, I uniquely choose pieces that will create a masterpiece. And like with sewing, God has chosen pieces of me to be His masterpiece.
Sickle cell disease is a blood disorder. That means that all the blood cells within the human body are not all whole. Majority of the blood cells are formed in a sickled shape. Because of the sickled shape, it can get blocked and get stuck in the arteries. Other issues can happen as well, meaning the blood cells are not receiving enough oxygen. So when the blood cells get stuck and they're not receiving enough oxygen, then that's when someone with sickle cell disease goes through something called a pain crisis. A pain crisis is just what it is. We are experiencing a lot of pain throughout our joints, primarily, throughout our body, our muscles, and it's excruciating. And with that pain, it cannot be subsided with over-the-counter medication. And so someone will have to go to the emergency room to get something, a dose that's much more stronger, with also they'll also give you hydration fluids to help the blood cells flow through the arteries. So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, born and raised, East Flatbush. For the most part, to my memory, I had a pretty normal childhood. My first encounter with a crisis that I can remember was having stomach pains. When you're a toddler, between the ages of 6 to 9, you typically experience what they call stomach pains, but it's not really the stomach that's paining you. It's actually the spleen that actually is can become enlarged due to sickle cell. And so I remember having really severe stomach pains, and my parents had to go to the emergency room with me. And for me, at that point, that's when I really understood that I had this condition. It was still not clear to me as a child at the age of 7 or 8 what it fully was, but I just know that I was not feeling well. But I was taken to the emergency room and I was cared for there. So moving along throughout my childhood into adolescence, that's when I hit puberty. That's when sickle cell disease became very real for me. At the age of 14, going through puberty, I started experiencing severe pain crises where I actually had to be admitted. And this was my first time remembering being admitted into the hospital, having IVs and having medication administered to me so that the pain could subside. Being in high school, there was this trip that I wanted to take, and it was going to be in the South. My parents, of course, were very worried. It was 2 days into the trip. We were in the South, and it was extremely hot. In the back of my mind, I know I was like, oh, I got to stay hydrated. I can't be in and out in the heat, but I still was in and out of extreme temperatures. Hours later, one thing led to another. I got sick, and I had to be rushed to the emergency room while on this trip. With sickle cell, usually I wake up in a pain crisis in my sleep. So I'll wake up out of my sleep and I feel discomfort. And wherever it chooses to trigger me, whether my knee joint, my shoulder joint, or multiple joints at one time, that's what would occur during a pain crisis. So knowing that this was potentially a factor before going on the trip, I didn't seek to give much thought to it because I wanted to enjoy myself. My dad had to take a flight, and for me, it was very sad because I was looking forward to doing this whole 10-day trip and proving my parents wrong that I can do this with this disease or not. Couldn't take a plane back home, so we had to ride home. It was about, I think, 16 hours in a car driving me back home. They tried to create a makeshift bed for me so I was comfortable because I was still experiencing pain. Medication does not take away the pain, it just kind of succumbs it a little bit.
Growing up in my house was eventful. There was always something going on, especially with 5 girls. Overall, it was a good experience because we leaned on one another as much as we fought. We did love each other and support one another, specifically with Jen. So being that she was the second sister, she kind of took on the role of the second mama in the house. Jen also took on the role of doing our hair. She had a lot of responsibility as being the second oldest. And I can imagine looking back now how much that was for her as a preteen young adult, to have the responsibility of taking care of a whole tribe, I like to say, of us. Being the youngest, there was a lot that I didn't know growing up. A lot just happened around me, but I remember specifically when Jen started to have more crises. And as she was having those crises and had to be in and out of the hospital, I started to notice something's not right. Like something's going on with my sister that's not normal, because none of my other sisters have had to go to the hospital. I can't remember explicitly if our parents ever sat us down and explained, this is sickle cell, this is what your sister has, this is what it means and why she ends up in the hospital. But it didn't click for me that she had sickle cell until she had a trip where she had to go down south with her school, and she ended up having a crisis. That was the first time I really felt afraid for my sister's life. And that was the first time where it clicked that she has a sickness that is changing the quality of life that she has, and it's limiting her. Fast forward to November 2022, Thanksgiving, we finally were able to gather as a family. We ate to our heart's content, and then after, I remember we were like, let's have a dance party. We were trying to do these TikTok dances, and it was a really great time. Jen was laughing, she was dancing, and everything was normal. And then we go home. Jen was fine. The next day, which is Black Friday, we get a text from Shania that Jen was experiencing pain. And that's not a text that we're not used to having, because sometimes Jen will have a mini crisis or just a flare-up where she'll have pain. I wasn't alarmed with that text because we've gotten so many texts like that before. As the night progressed, we were always sleeping, and Shania was sending us updates like, hey, we actually are going to the hospital. The pain is not subsiding.
I met Jen first virtually. We both just happened to join a tribe called Women at the Well. Jen and I's friendship and sisterhood began to flourish from meeting virtually and then just intentionally spending more time together as sisters. But seeing Jen, I never would have thought she was afflicted with anything. But when she revealed that she had sickle cell, I was very, very taken aback, because visually, like, she doesn't appear at all to be struggling with something like sickle cell. November 26th, 2022, life really changed. This crisis was very different because all of her pain is what I would say unbearable, because that's what sends her to the hospital. But I will say with this crisis, it was excruciating, and it was different for me witnessing it, because you know how, like, when you're in a horror film and somebody comes out of the thing and jumps and scares you, like you have a blood curdling scream and you just like scream to the top of your lungs. That's the level of screaming that was happening for Jen. The meds that we had here, they were not working, and throughout this time it was not subsiding. Sometimes she goes through pain crisis and then it subsides because she can sleep, but this was like constant screaming, constant pain. So we finally just decided to go to the hospital. So we're driving to the hospital. She's still trying to maintain her pain, but I knew that this was different because there was no gap really in her screaming. There was no respite for her. So we get her to the ER. This time there was a physician there that actually was familiar with sickle cell disease. When physicians are familiar with sickle cell disease, they understand that they need to move quickly. She was getting the IV that needed to happen quickly. She wasn't kind of wasting time trying to find veins. She kind of just went in where she could. I think at this point she had gotten an IV in Jen's neck and it gotten her some meds. So we thought that the crisis was subsiding. The physician is familiar with sickle cell, so she said, I'm going to go with what Jennifer says. If Jennifer thinks she can go home and maintain this pain, you all just let me know. So we were there for a few hours. The meds started to kick in. Jen thought that she was able to maintain at home. But as the night went on, the pain, the same excruciating pain that was happening before started to happen again. So we went through the cycle, tried all the things. We knew at some point that it was time to go back to the hospital. So we went back, and at that point she was admitted. She was still screaming even on the ER floor. It got to a point where, and this is unfortunate, the healthcare system actually put us in another section of the ER because they didn't want to hear her scream.